questions about medical care. If there's any specific questions about medical care, I would refer you to your own physicians or some true expert. Okay. So I always begin with this slide, because in case there's anybody new to the field, dementia refers to an umbrella term that has to do with a progressive loss of brain cells. It's estimated there's 100 billion cells packed into our skulls. And for reasons that are not clear, dementia results in a loss of those brain cells and brain functions, such as memory, thinking, language ability. Ultimately, it leads to an inability to care for oneself. And it's usually comprised of one or more diseases, such as those listed here. Alzheimer's disease, Lewy body dementia, vascular dementia, Parkinson's dementia, mixed types, so that would be a combination of the above. And there are 50 rare types. Perhaps you've heard of frontotemporal dementia, which has been in the news in the last year, which has affected Bruce Willis, primary progressive aphasia, and a host of other very rare diseases. Currently, about 6.5 million Americans are affected by dementia and over 50 million worldwide. And like the graphic I have on the screen, it's almost like a tree. The brain is like a tree that loses leaves over time. But unlike the natural process of losing leaves in the fall here in the Midwest, dementia is an unnatural process. Most older people, most people in general, do not develop dementia. So we're trying to figure out the mechanisms for the loss of brain cells that ultimately require someone to need care at home or in a care facility. This is Dr. Alzheimer. In 1906, he was the first one to describe Alzheimer's disease. He followed a woman in her 50s. That's what we call young onset Alzheimer's disease. And he described, following her death, results of an autopsy he did on her brain. And he described the abnormal buildup of proteins in her brain. And these are now known as amyloid plaques and tau tangles, along with losses of connections among brain cells. And again, we don't know what causes this abnormal buildup of these plaques and tangles, but that appears to be the prime focus of medical intervention today. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. Other pathologies such as inflammation in the brain and infection is not quite clear. Even though we've been seriously studying Alzheimer's and other dementias in the United States now for about 30 years, we are still very far away from really understanding the full nature of dementia, its causes, its effects, disability, but we really are at a loss to understand all the different causes. There's no singular factor in Alzheimer's disease, except in very rare cases where it's a clear genetic mutation. At least half the people with dementia have Alzheimer's type dementia. And unfortunately, most of the research is focused on just Alzheimer's disease. And so it really doesn't speak to any kind of breakthroughs in either diagnosis or treatment with respect to those other related dementias that I mentioned: Lewy body dementia, frontotemporal dementia, Parkinson's related dementia. But even if we successfully treat people with Alzheimer's disease, it'll cover about half the people who have dementia today. Unfortunately, we are still at a loss to come up with any kind of simple means of making a diagnosis. Most physicians today still rely upon looking at patients through history and physical, doing some cognitive testing, running some blood tests to exclude things like pernicious anemia that may mimic Alzheimer's disease. They do a brain scan, either CT or MRI, to look for tumor or stroke. They might order other tests, such as a spinal fluid test, to look for any kind of infections in the brain. Now, what is significant in the last 10 to 15 years, there has been improvements in technology using PET scan that can detect beta amyloid protein and spinal fluid, which can be rather unpleasant. Trust me, I've had spinal tap, and it's rather painful. But these two things, PET scans and spinal fluid, can detect both amyloid protein and tau protein. And this has enabled physicians to come up with a probable diagnosis, not a definitive diagnosis. That is still only available by looking at brain tissue under a microscope. That's seldom done with a biopsy. So it's done after death, postmortem autopsy, the way Dr. Alzheimer did it 125 years ago. So that's the only way to come up with a definitive diagnosis of any of these types of dementia. However, neurologists are the ones who are employing PET scan and spinal fluid to come up with a probable diagnosis. So they're getting very, very good at pinpointing. We are still awaiting a future test that will solely use a sample of blood to detect the presence of Alzheimer's disease and other types of dementias. There's also been research done looking at the presence of amyloid in the back of the brain, but that is not yet commercially available. I'm hoping in the next 5 years, we might have a breakthrough in this regard. And actually, Bill Gates, as you know, the originator of Microsoft, but also a great philanthropist, he has devoted a ton of money looking for a simple and effective test for Alzheimer's and other dementias. So I think with his help and help of brilliant scientists around the world, we're going to come up with a simple, commercially available test real soon that will eliminate the need for more expensive PET scans and painful spinal fluid. If you have a friend or relative, colleague, please refer them to some of these local specialists. They are staffed by world-class neurologists. I put Rush and the Mesolin Cognitive Neurology Center at Northwestern in red because they're federally funded centers. They are cutting edge when it comes to research, but there are also fine neurologists at Advocate Memory Center in Park Ridge, Ascension Brothers Neuroscience Institute, as well as University of Chicago Memory Center. So for my money, these are the go-to places. Most primary care physicians will make a diagnosis of Alzheimer's and other dementias, and they might not exactly know which type it is. They'll say it's dementia of likely Alzheimer's disease just based on statistics alone. And that may not make a heck of a lot of difference to the patients or their families. But if you want to be enrolled in research and get the most specific diagnosis, you need to see a subspecialist at one of these centers. So the current state of medicine are these 5 oral drugs, donepezil, galantamine, rivastigmine, memantine, also Namenda XR, which is a form of Namenda, but extended release. And then there's a combination of both memantine and donepezil that's called Namzaric. Now, these drugs have been commonly prescribed over the last 15, 20 years. However, they have proven very, very disappointing. Most people do not respond. If they do respond at all, it's temporary. And as a result, most people give up on these drugs after a while. They're expensive. They are covered by Medicare and Medicaid, but they have really been disappointing because they've only treated the symptoms, but in a very mild, temporary kind of way. And they really don't get to the root causes, which appear to be, I say appear because we don't know for sure, but they don't really attack the amyloid and the tau protein that build up. There's a drug recently approved by the FDA for the treatment of people who have agitation associated with dementia, and it's called Rexulti. Now, the good news about this drug, it appears to have fewer side effects than the drugs that have been prescribed off-label for people with agitation. I'm talking about risperidone, for example, a whole class of antipsychotics, atypical antipsychotics that have been used way too often. And but Rexulti, the safety profile seems to be a bit improved over those atypical antipsychotics. So that has just been approved by the FDA, and I think you'll see it on patients' charts in pretty short order. But there are safety concerns, risk of stroke, risk of heart attack. All these drugs have complications. Please know that At any given time, there's probably 200 different studies going on, not only looking at treating the underlying causes of Alzheimer's disease and prevention, but also looking at ways to improve care. Okay, so there's a new class of anti-amyloid drugs that have been in the news a lot over the last year, starting with Aduhelm, which turned out to be a commercial bomb because, first of all, Biogen, the maker of the drug, came out and set a price tag of $52,000 a year. There was also some evidence of collusion between the FDA regulators and the drug company. It's been the source of congressional investigations. It just has been dirty business, but ultimately Medicare denied reimbursement for this drug. They ultimately dropped the price to $26,000 a year. These are drugs that are infused into the bloodstream. So twice a month, people with Alzheimer's disease have got to go to an infusion center, get these drugs, and risk some nasty side effects, such as brain swelling and brain bleeds, which can hasten their dementia. In other words, accelerate the progression of their disease. In addition to the costs, they have to pay for MRIs. There's a lot of complications here with respect to funding. So Aduhelm is being paid for, but only among those who are participating in research studies involving Aduhelm. The maker of the drug, Biogen, is continuing to try to improve upon this particular version of the drug with different dosing. The latest drug to be approved is Leqembi, and that did get accelerated approval in 2023, but Medicare has initially denied this drug because of the safety profile. They did a cost-benefit analysis. They're not convinced at the FDA that there are enough benefits to justify the cost of this drug. In other words, not a lot of people improve cognitively or slow the rate of their cognitive decline. Interestingly, the VA has approved the cost of $26,000 a year for this particular drug. Later this year, the FDA will vote on giving full approval as opposed to initial accelerated approval. That may change the funding mechanism for Medicare. We don't know. Now, the next drug, donanemab, just today was in the news. This is breaking news. So turn on your TVs, your radios, you're going to hear about this drug called donanemab that today got a lot of press because results of a major study showed cognitive decline by 35%, and it showed it slowed functional decline, that means ADL decline, by 40% over an 18-month period among study participants who had early stage Alzheimer's disease. Unfortunately, about 40% of the individuals who had this infusion drug had side effects like brain swelling and brain bleeds, but only 1.6% of those had serious side effects that resulted in death. That's a pretty serious side effect. So also about 8.7% were reported to have infusion-related incidents. So, poking them in the arm, there might have been some bleeding there. There might have been discomfort. Eli Lilly, the maker of this drug, is very excited about this and will apply for FDA approval this quarter. They reported that today. So I think this drug is probably superior to Leqembi and Aduhelm, but I think it's going to be up to individuals and their physicians to really determine, is this worthwhile? Is the cost-benefit analysis going to be worthwhile enough for Medicare to offer reimbursement? These are very expensive drugs. If Leqembi at 26 grand a year is any indication, I would expect Eli Lilly trying to set a price such as that as well. There are a lot of supplements that you hear about on TV, radio, online, and unfortunately, none of these things are proven. They say clinically proven. Well, that's a bunch of nonsense. They've never been subjected to randomized controlled trials, which are the gold standard for any kind of FDA-approved drug. In my humble opinion, these are all based on junk science, despite the commercial success of these things. I don't put any stock in them whatsoever, but Americans are trying anything to try to stem the tide of dementia and to either prevent it or slow it down. And so these things are out there on the market. Even though the FDA is required to approve them and have not approved them, they are still commercially available. And I just think it's unconscionable. Sorry if you've got money wrapped up in these companies, but I feel very strongly that people are just barking up the wrong tree here. And likewise, there are many experts, MDs and PhDs who claim to have found the magic elixir, come up with medical programs, non-medical programs to prevent or even reverse the symptoms of dementia. Unfortunately, none of these experts have submitted their studies and their evidence to scrutiny for others to replicate. And therefore, I don't put any stock in them as well. I spent 13 years at the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center, and I was trained by neuroscientists who believed in evidence. And so, again, products and programs like these that lack solid evidence that can be replicated by others are really lacking. Let's quickly talk about some of the other types of dementia. Lewy body dementia, the symptoms include, for lack of a better way of describing it, it's like a combination of Parkinson's disease and Alzheimer's disease, but there are problems with thinking, movement, behavior, and hallucinations. All these symptoms usually occur within the same year. It has to do with abnormal deposits of another protein called alpha supernuclein in the brain. They're also called Lewy bodies. The Alzheimer's drugs, those oral drugs, and the Parkinson's drugs are often prescribed off-label for Lewy body dementia. Likewise, vascular dementia having to do with small or large strokes in the brain. Usually, blood pressure drugs are prescribed to prevent further hemorrhagic strokes and ischemic strokes. This kind of dementia is often seen with both Lewy body dementia and Alzheimer's disease, but the Alzheimer's drugs are prescribed off-label for this type of dementia. And Parkinson's disease dementia, which is again related to Lewy body dementia, roughly 20 to 50% of people with Parkinson's, which is, as you know, primarily a movement disorder, roughly 20 to 50% of people also develop cognitive problems. Usually it's mild, but over time it can get quite serious and people can develop severe dementia. Rivastigmine, one of those 5 drugs, oral drugs approved by the FDA, is the only FDA-approved drug treatment for Parkinson's-related dementia. By the way, a friend of mine died of Parkinson's-related dementia last year. I was his POA. He and I talked about rivastigmine as well as the other drugs, and we decided together that we were not interested in this drug because we considered it to be another example of false hope. Mild cognitive impairment, you have heard this term, MCI. It's a condition in which people have more memory or thinking problems than people their own age. The symptoms are not as severe as those with full-blown dementia. People with MCI usually can take care of themselves at home and carry out their normal activities, but they are forgetful. And what's worrisome is if you track these people with MCI, about half of them will develop full-blown dementia within 5 years. Therefore, it's believed that in these cases, MCI is actually a precursor to the onset of Alzheimer's or other types of dementia. Now, these folks make great subjects for drug intervention studies to try to prevent that progression from MCI to full-blown dementia. Unfortunately, to date, the Alzheimer's drugs have been ineffective in stopping the progression. But those anti-amyloid drugs that I noted, they are now being used in many studies to target people with MCI. And that's sort of the holy grail of all of these drug intervention studies, to try to identify people with plaques and tangles before the onset of symptoms like forgetfulness and thinking problems, and intervene, eliminate plaques and tangles so that they don't develop full-blown symptoms. So we know that dementia is caused by many complex and interrelated genetic and lifestyle factors. There are childhood, midlife, and late life factors that play a role in decreasing or increasing risk. And I'll come back to this in a bit. Again, we now know that the pathology, the plaques and tangles, develop 10 to 20 years before the onset of symptoms. Unfortunately, it appears that plaques and tangles alone are not the only culprits involved. I mentioned inflammation, possible role of infection, but the drugs, the anti-amyloid drugs like the Quemby and this new one by Eli Lilly, they seem to be cleaning up some of that amyloid and tau that may contribute to some slowing of cognitive decline and slowing of functional decline. My bottom line here is that science is progressing at a snail's pace. When I worked at Rush in 1991, we were part of the clinical trials of the first drug approved by the FDA called Cognex, which is no longer on the market due to side effects. But there was a lot of hoopla, a lot of hope. And I remember our lead physician saying he thought there was going to be an effective treatment and prevention of Alzheimer's disease within 10 years. Now, we said that in 1990. Here we are in 2023, and we still are a long ways away. Making progress, but it's slow. So this slide really tells you where we're at. Right now, we're focused in on treating people with mild early stage dementia with these drugs. Once somebody has progressed to the middle or moderate stage or severe stage, these drugs don't do anything. So the real target population are people with early stage or mild dementia, but even better yet, most of the clinical trials today are focusing in on people with MCI, and there are even clinical trials involving people who are asymptomatic or fit the description of what's been termed preclinical phase of dementia. They got plaques and tangles. They might be somebody like me. I'm 71 years old. If we did a little PET scan, we might find plaques and tangles. I might be a great subject of a study who would be enrolled for the next 10 years and might get an anti-amyloid drug to see if there were, if we enroll thousands of people my age over a period of 10 years, naturally, over time, many people would develop dementia. Well, maybe there were people who got the drug who didn't develop full-blown dementia. That would be a sign of success, okay? But these require great investment of time and money by drug companies. I know why they spend a lot of money, and they are trying to recoup their money as well. So I mentioned risk factors. Right now, the most important risk factor is getting older. In the age group age 75 to 84, roughly 1 in 5, 20% develop dementia. After age 85, about 1 in 3 develop dementia. Think about your senior living community there at Belmont Village. I bet you, Melinda, probably average age is 80, 88, maybe 90. They would fit the profile of people with dementia. For reasons we don't understand, African Americans are twice as likely than whites to develop dementia. Likewise, Latinos are 1.5 times more likely to develop dementia. Also, people with Down syndrome, which we know has a genetic basis, they are at very high risk of dementia after age 50. Roughly 50 to 75% will develop dementia after age 60. There are rare predictive genes affecting people with younger onset dementia, but they comprise less than 1% of the cases. Predictive genes have also been associated with frontotemporal dementia. There are so-called susceptibility genes. So we all carry susceptibility genes for different diseases like heart disease, cancer, stroke, diabetes. In the case of dementia or Alzheimer's disease specifically, there's a gene that's been identified called ApoE4. You can have a blood test for this. It just means if you have 2 copies of this ApoE4, one from your mother, one from your father, you're at a pretty high risk of developing dementia after age 65. How much is that risk? We don't know, okay? There's also susceptibility gene associated with African Americans called ABCA7. Again, it increases the risk of dementia among African Americans. But I look at it this way, genes are sort of like the bullets in a gun. It's environment that serves as the trigger, okay? So in the example of lung cancer, we all know by now that if you smoke cigarettes, any tobacco products, you are increasing your risk for cancer, all right? That's because maybe you were genetically susceptible to developing cancer, but also by smoking, you accelerated your risk. And that might have been the trigger that caused cancer, lung cancer. So there are things that have been identified in the research. There are many lifestyle and health interventions that may prevent or reduce the risk of dementia. And there are 2 major studies that have been put out, one by the National Academies of Science, Engineering, Medicine, also the Lancet Commission, that's from Great Britain, on dementia prevention, treatment, and care. They estimate that 1/3 of all cases of dementia may be preventable through modifiable health and lifestyle improvements. So what are they? First of all, reducing our risk for heart disease, diabetes, midlife hypertension, midlife obesity, and by increasing our education level. So in other words, people who have higher levels of education appear to be at lower risk. Now, people with higher levels of education tend to have higher incomes, and people with higher incomes happen to have greater access to healthcare and may have better access to better foods. So this is sort of a confounding factor, but taking all things together, education level seems to mitigate the risk of Alzheimer's disease. So think about early childhood education, education throughout our lives. It may be a mitigating factor. But more realistically, because for most of us, education is behind us, formal education is behind us, making sure that we don't develop heart disease, diabetes, hypertension, or obesity. Because all people who have those conditions are a dramatic increase for dementia. Also, brain injuries, especially those due to sports. And I have a picture here of Aaron Hernandez, a very tragic figure who played football for the NFL. He eventually developed serious brain impairments that landed him in jail, and he committed suicide in jail. I mean, he committed homicide, suicide, just a terrible tragedy. And upon his death, they did an autopsy. His brain was riddled with plaques and tangles and chronic traumatic encephalopathy, or CTE, which is associated with brain injuries from contact sports like football. Sleep apnea, which affects millions of people. Treating that is important for brain health. Also depression, whether it's talk therapy or medication therapy, and of course smoking. Smoking has been associated with an increased risk of dementia as well as cancer. So what are some possible ways of reducing risk? I'm going to just focus in on these 4: cognitive engagement, social activities, physical exercise, and the mind diet. So in cognitive engagement means working, either engaging in paid work or unpaid work. So that means instead of just becoming a couch potato after retirement, no, moving and engaging yourself mentally, taking classes, reading books, writing, doing puzzles, card games, playing a musical instrument. Unfortunately, there's been a lot of money spent on brain training programs by software companies, and thus far, no no evidence to support the use of these training programs. There's I should say no evidence, there's very weak evidence. Now, where did I get this information? There have been loads and loads of studies based on population studies of older adults, most of them living in senior living communities, who have agreed to annual testing of their cognitive skills, their functional abilities, and they've had brain scans, blood tests, and they are followed for the rest of their lives, and upon death, they have agreed to brain autopsy. Some of the most notable studies came out of the Baltimore longitudinal study, the Honolulu study, and the study through the Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center. And the results of, following thousands of people over time, it was determined that cognitive engagement was a great way to reduce the risk of dementia. I'm not saying it will prevent dementia, it will reduce the risk. Socialization, this is key. Living with someone either at home or in a community reduces the risk for dementia. Not to mention reduces the risk for loneliness, which we know is also associated with the onset of dementia. So it means, regular contact with other people is important for our mental health as well as our brain health. And the theory here is that social interaction with other people appears to strengthen our short-term memory and our thinking skills and our language skills. If we're not around other people all the time, it almost leads to this notion, we're just atrophying. It's the equivalent of being a couch potato. We're not using our intellectual abilities. So socialization is key here. So it's really important that all these millions of people with dementia, probably at least 1 million of them, are living alone. They're widowed, they're divorced, they're by themselves. They need to be around other people. Ultimately, they're going to need a lot of help at home. But why wait for that critical time in their lives when they're just begging for help or their families are saying, we got to do something, right? Melinda, I'm looking at you on the screen because I'm thinking about all the people that you see, and the relatives have been struggling with the dementia with their loved ones for years. And then all of a sudden, they want to do something now. Now, the savvy ones will start investigating 1 or 2 or 3 years in advance, okay? But I would argue that sooner the better. Now, I know there's all kinds of factors like costs involved and so forth, but if all things being equal, if we can, enable people to move into senior living communities, whether it's independent living or assisted living, to get them into a place where they're safe, where they're getting socialization, physical activities, and cognitive engagement. Physical exercise stands out as probably the most studied intervention of all, not only for the treatment of obesity and cancer and heart disease, but also for dementia. So participating in exercise programs, either alone or in a group, have known benefits for reducing the risk of dementia. And there are several NIA-funded studies right now looking at physical exercise as a means to reduce the risk of dementia. But there have been smaller studies, not involving thousands of people, but the evidence is pretty convincing over the last 15 years. Lastly, the MIND diet, which was started by a former colleague of mine at Rush Alzheimer's Disease Center, Martha Claire Morris. That led to her large observational study over a period of 10 years, have led to other observational studies, and more recently, a double-blind placebo-controlled study that showed that adherence to this particular diet, which is a combination of the Mediterranean diet, a diet rich in fruits and vegetables, low in red meat, high in fish, and the DASH diet, which is prescribed for people with hypertension, that this particular diet can reduce dementia as much as 53%. Very, very impressive. I've changed my diet to conform with this. It's easy. I'm surprised that more and more senior living communities have not adopted this as an option for their residents, but it ought to be available the same way we have heart healthy diet choices on menus in restaurants. We should have that available, certainly in senior living communities. So check out the Mind Diet. I mentioned prevention studies. There's the EXERT study looking at exercise program for people ages 65 to 89 who have MCI to see if exercise alone can prevent the progression to full-blown dementia. And then there's the Pointer study, which is based on a very highly successful study done in Finland that includes a multimodal intervention, exercise, nutritional counseling, like, to promote the use of the Mind Diet, cognitive and social stimulation, and improved self-management of comorbidities such as hypertension, diabetes, heart disease. This is being used among adults ages 60 to 79 who have a family history of dementia. So you can look up the Pointer study as well as the EXERT study. I believe both EXERT and Pointer are available here in the Chicagoland area. Just very quickly, I want to mention non-drug interventions. I'm a social worker, so I've always been a fan of these studies. There are some very well-conducted studies, but for the most part, solid evidence using double-blind controlled studies are lacking. But music therapy, massage, time slips, creative storytelling, and art interventions offer greater potential benefits to reduce behavioral symptoms than drug interventions. This much is clear. We've been using drug interventions, like risperidone for ages, and they've had nasty side effects. These particular interventions don't have any of the nasty side effects. However, you need staff time to employ them. So this is usually the purview of people who are in the activities or life enrichment programs, but I would highly recommend, daily doses of music. I'm a great fan of time slips. I served on the board of time slips for about 6 years. I can't say enough good things about time slips. A very simple intervention. Of course, art is a wonderful way to involve people with dementia. Also, there have been a great deal of studies involving family caregivers to reduce their stress and their reactions to their loved ones' symptoms. And we do know that family members who receive education, sometimes in structured classes, are much better off emotionally and are much more prone to seek respite, including adult day services, as well as home care services, as well as seeking support within a community. They're much better off than people who don't receive education. So just to finish up here, then we'll open up for questions. I would direct you to the National Institutes of Health Alzheimer's Disease Education and Referral Center, known as the ADR Center. They have a toll-free number. The Alzheimer's Association, which is based here in Chicago, also toll-free number 24/7. Very rich websites for both those organizations. Also the Lewy Body Disease Dementia Association. And I would recommend, if you are interested in participating in research for people age 60 and older, go to the Alzheimer's Prevention Registry at endalznow.org. And if you want to hear about what the government is doing, for the last 10 years, we've had the National Alzheimer's Project Act, which has been trying to coordinate the support of many different governmental organizations and fund not only caregivers, but some of these non-farm interventions to help people with dementia. So I think that is it. And let's open it up.
Wow, Dan, that was great. Thank you so much. My goodness. If you'd like to ask any questions and putting some right here into the chat, by all means. Melinda, I know that you can see those as well. I think you have a little bit more control over some of those too. I think I can see this as well. That is wonderful. But that presentation was fantastic. I did not know that about, now his name just escaped me, the gentleman from the football who had ended up committing suicide. that they did that autopsy and saw all those plaques and tangles. I had no idea about that. That is shocking, Dan.
I just bring him up because he's probably the most infamous example, but there have been other ones. Dave Dewerson of the great Chicago Bears,
Right.
He died by suicide, and he insisted that an autopsy be done, and sure enough, he also had CTE.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's just terrible. I mean, and that Dave Dewerson case too was a widely publicized one as well. I remember when that happened as well. But yeah, any questions out there that you have for Dan or about the presentation itself today? Feel free.
I do have one. One person asked, Dan, if someone does notice mild cognitive impairment, what type of specialist would you send them to? Would you send them to a neurologist or a clinical psychologist? Or what should be their first step?
Great question. So there are general neurologists, and then there are some specialists who just focus in on cognitive issues, right? Neurologists deal with a wide range of problems like headaches and epilepsy and so forth. So I would go to one of those centers that I mentioned for specialized neurologists, and they also employ their neuropsychologists. Neuropsychologists are really terrific at drilling down into different areas of the brain to look at language skills, to look at memory and thinking skills. They will subject people to testing for an hour or two. And if there are any deficits, they're going to pick up on them. They'll pick up on things that even the most skilled neurologist is not going to pick up on through an exam. So you can start with the neuropsychologist, or you can see a neurologist in combination with a neuropsychologist. But I take MCI very seriously. I'm afraid, Melissa, today that there are too many physicians out there who are labeling people with MCI who indeed already have Alzheimer's disease. And when you hear the term mild cognitive impairment, it sounds like it's no big deal, right? It's like, but the way I look about it, it's like being mildly pregnant. I mean, seriously, it's a big deal. These are people who are struggling to remember things. And by putting a nice sounding label on it like MCI, it may be missing the boat. That these are people who cannot manage their money, perhaps, that they're making poor judgments. They're keeping the gas on while cooking meals. They're getting lost while driving. So there's a whole range of problems that the term MCI may not be covering. So unless you see a specialist, you might be missing out on the full-blown dementia diagnosis.
Yeah, thank you for the question. That is a great question. Absolutely. And Dan, too, that normal forgetfulness, sometimes, I always use that example that you've given, over the years of, forgetting your keys. You walk in the house, you put your keys down, you can't find them. That's normal forgetfulness. But putting your keys and finding them in the freezer, that's not normal. The regular everyday type of things, those little nuances of what's normal and what's not normal, and having that kind of baseline of things, it's just appropriate, not appropriate.
Yeah. I might add, my mother-in-law was diagnosed with MCI about 1.5 years ago, and I was not happy with that diagnosis. And because I saw things that clearly the clinicians didn't see. And, I did happen to write a book called Alzheimer's Early Stages. So I've been studying this for a long, long time. And so when that MCI diagnosis came out, family members, some of them just sort of shrugged and said, well, it's not Alzheimer's disease, thank God. And I'm like, well, sure enough, within 6 months, she's locking herself out of her house. She's getting increasingly paranoid. We had to move her. And, we took her back to the doctor, with all this now, all these reports from family members. Oh, let's change that diagnosis to Alzheimer's disease. Like, all along, I knew it. I just knew it. But, this is my mother-in-law, so it's not my mom. I couldn't I couldn't push the envelope. I got to keep peace, with my wife and her 9 siblings. So I just had to wait for the house of cards to fall until they sort of woke up to what was going on and then take action. Fortunately, they did listen to me when it came to powers of attorney for property and healthcare. We had that lined up. And ultimately, we did sell her house and we moved her, now living with many of us over the course of time.
Oh, Dan, you're always so good with that, as we know.
I'm unfortunately, I now describe myself as a dementia magnet.
You are the dementia magnet, Dan. Many conversations over many years, my friend. Oh my goodness. Well, again, any other questions, feel free. You can feel free to type them in, or even, feel free to come on camera and ask as well. We're happy to talk. We've got a couple more minutes here. And again, just a reminder that you will be, I can't stress it enough, that you will be getting an email with a evaluation. And that evaluation is so important because we will be asking too, again, for your correct spelling of your first and last name, your information for your license number, as well as a correct phone number and email address. And you will have your certificate sent to you via email within after about 14 days time for processing to be allowed. And I'll be happy to include a copy of today's recording for you as well in that email too. Okay. And I see someone popped on. Jen, do you have a question?
I do. So I think, Dan, one of the questions is when somebody gets an MCI diagnosis, it sounds like that's the perfect time, if they haven't already done so already, to get their powers of attorney in place and so forth. And so many times I think families wait so long to do that, but at what kind of stage in that disease process would you say we're too late for that? Because sometimes I feel like they're waiting so long, and it's trying to get people to get these things done beforehand.
Yeah, as you know, Jen, sooner the better. Everybody on this call should have powers of attorney. Everybody. It should be a requirement to get out of college. But anyway, when is it too late? Practically speaking, when someone's in the early stages, I'm afraid that some family members would say, well, it's too late. They assigned Susie, and Susie's just the wrong person to be her agent. I should be the one. If she'd been diagnosed, maybe she used poor judgment to assign Susie as her POA. And by the way, Susie, I've never really trusted her anyway. So I should be in charge. That's when it gets sticky, Jen, because family members start fighting about control. And if the diagnosis has already been made, maybe, just maybe, someone's going to hire an attorney to call into question that appointment. And so I think to eliminate any of that kind of nonsense, and it is nonsense because it can be done earlier. And so, that in my terrible scenario that I just laid out, that can get into, guardianship and real expensive stuff and fighting between family members. So, I don't care how well families have worked together in the past, that sibling rivalry that maybe existed long ago, it has its way of rearing its ugly head in the context of a parent with dementia. So I don't know, if everybody's working together, or if there's just an only child, early stage Alzheimer's disease, no one's going to probably question it unless that person happens to be a crook and other people are looking in saying, you know what, they're just vultures just waiting to gain access. We all know about financial exploitation being the leading cause of elder abuse. So we got to be proactive. We got to counsel these family members, ASAP today. And you don't need an attorney. There are forms at the State of Illinois Department on Aging website. My favorite one is very easy. It's the 5 wishes. You can find that online. You don't need an attorney to do a POA for property or healthcare. Now, if you're going to get into a trust, of course, you got to get, probably an elder law attorney involved with that. But yeah, get that done now.
Dan, is that 5wishes.com? I'm like typing it in as we speak.
I don't know if it's, I think it's fivewishes.org. It's a nonprofit.
Okay, I see it, 5wishes.org. Okay, thank you. That's huge. I will get that done for myself and my
Yeah,
husband.
please do. That's the one I've had for years, and I've
Okay.
updated. You know,
Awesome. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for being with us today. We truly, truly appreciate it. And thanks for being a friend of Belmont Village. Come see us sometime soon. We just went through a renovation last year. As you can see, I'm sitting in the screening room, so.
I
And
see it.
it's
all the time.
spectacular. All right. Well, thank you guys all so much for tuning in today, and look for that email shortly in the next few days with the evaluation, and we will go from there, everyone. But thank you guys so much for taking time out of your day, enjoying your lunch with us. And if you have any questions about Belmont Village or All Trust Home Care, please feel free to reach out to us. We do appreciate your time today. Thank you very, very much. And Melinda, you can go ahead and stop that recording too, and we will be able to assist you guys in any way that you need. Thank you very much. Have a great day, all. Melinda and Dan, we can stay on for a few minutes too, if you'd like.